Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, whatever time it is for you in your part of the world. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on engaging today's workforce and creating synergy across the organization. This webinar is hosted by Talent Smart EQ, and in case any of you aren't familiar with us, we specialize in emotional intelligence development through training, assessments, certification, and coaching. Our talent and development firm has been in business for over 20 years, and we bring a unique focus solely on emotional intelligence, or EQ. My name is Madison, the marketing manager here at Talent Smart EQ, and I'll be your host and technical producer today. Before I introduce my partner for the webinar, I'd just like to run through a few quick housekeeping items. On the side of your screen, you should see the GoToWebinar panel, which is where you can adjust your audio settings. The webinar should run for approximately 25 to 30 minutes of content, and then at the end, we'll have about 10 minutes reserved for a question and answer from the audience. The webinar is going to be recorded, and everyone will receive a recording to the email that they registered with about an hour after the webinar ends. Additionally, on screen at the end of the webinar, a short survey is going to appear with about 5 questions and the ability to provide some comments about your experience today. We just use this feedback to continually improve your experience so that we can create content that's helpful, valuable, insightful, and enjoyable to all of you. So please go ahead and fill that out at the end if you have, a couple extra seconds. As I mentioned, we will be holding that Q&A at the end, and you should see a question field in your GoToWebinar panel. So at any time during today's webinar, even if it's after we start the Q&A, please feel free to type a question into that section, and we'll try and circle back at the end and answer as many of those as we have time for. Lastly, our host today, Sherry, will be having a follow-up Zoom event with any of you that are interested to dive deeper into today's topic. You'll have all the details on that at the end of the webinar, so don't worry about that yet. That does wrap up all of our housekeeping items. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my partner for today's webinar and get started.
Hello,
everyone. Oh, sorry, Sherry.
No, that's okay, Maddie. I jumped in too early. You take it away.
We're just eager to start, huh?
I
I'll go ahead and introduce you, Sherry. So our host today, Sherry, Dr. Sherry Duchok. She is a director of training here at Talent Smart, and she's been working with clients for over 10 years, helping them link emotional intelligence, or EQ, to their challenges. Take it away, Sherry.
Thanks, Maddie. I'll tell you, sometimes passion gets in the way, doesn't it? So I am thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for that introduction. I am going to lead us on a conversation that, as Maddie mentioned, will be followed up in a month on Zoom. But I'd like to share with you what we are covering today together on the webinar. So the first thing that we are going to look at is defining employee engagement. There are still a lot of misunderstandings out there about what employee engagement looks like. So we want to address that directly. We're going to review studies on employee engagement. Let's look at what the research shows. There's a lot of opinions circulating, but let's look at the data. We'll also discuss the role of EQ in engaging others. What we have learned is emotional intelligence lays a foundation for so many of our training initiatives, and employee engagement is no different. So we will also discover some very practical EQ strategies to increase employee engagement. Of course, we're going to make some time for questions, and then we will provide that specific guidance on next month's follow-up discussion so that we can check in with you on how your journey is when it comes to employee engagement. So before we dive further into this specific agenda, though, Maddie, what I would love to do, I think it would be really interesting to see what our audience's experience is with employee engagement within their organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to set a little poll up for all of you, and it's going to be on how do you feel employee engagement is in your organization. So your options are: we are actively engaged, we are somewhat engaged, and we are simply doing our work. I'll give you all a few seconds here to go ahead and answer that question. All right, and there's your results.
Okay, all right, really interesting. Thank you so much, Maddie, for handling that poll. So we've got about 20% of you who are saying you are actively engaged. 60% 62% say you're somewhat engaged, and 18% say you're just doing your work. Now, I recognize that we may have a skewed sample here. You know, obviously we've got a group of people who have logged on voluntarily for an optional webinar. So it's not as if this would necessarily accurately reflect maybe a larger sample that is made up of some different people. But I think it's important that we all know who's here and what are you experiencing as we further this discussion. So now that all of you have weighed in, let's begin by clarifying what employee engagement really means. You know, many people still believe that employee engagement is just all about, are people happy and do they feel good? They think if you regularly see people laughing in the break room together, that's enough and everyone is engaged. The truth, however, is that employee engagement cannot be gauged in these ways. You know, I will tell you, as an outside consultant who's been working in different countries and across industries for over 25 years now, I have seen a lot of people in my presence share a lot of laughter when they're venting around the things that keep them disengaged. So what we have to recognize is that employee engagement actually relies on employees having experiences that lead to productivity and further desirable business outcomes. In other words, truly engaged employees not only feel better, but they feel more valued, more productive, and more effective in implementing the company's vision and the company's goals. So, because employee engagement is not just about well-being, it's also about the bottom line, it's really important that we look at the reality of current employee engagement in the research that we're seeing. So we've got two studies to look at here, and I wanted to give you some comparison. So what we're looking at is the Gallup survey data that reflects 2022 responses in the US, so the year 2022. And then we have an ADP global study that was conducted in 2018. So first of all, the Gallup study shows that only 32% of respondents reported being fully engaged in their work. Now, another 17% chimed in their scale, saying that they were actively but not fully engaged. That means that over half of the respondents didn't report high levels of engagement in their work. Now, if we add to it the ADP responses, we can see that only 16% of respondents reported full engagement, which means the remaining full 84% said in this survey that they were simply showing up and doing their job. Now, these results are at the very least concerning, if not somewhat disastrous for some organizations. So the question then becomes, how do we combat these trends that we are seeing? So if we turn to what experts in employee engagement are saying, the first thing we have to keep in mind is that the answer lies in team behaviors, not the larger company culture. And think about it. Individuals are most impacted on a daily basis by those that we see and work with regularly. So team leaders actually play a big role in engagement of the overall company. You know, we know from our work in the field of emotional intelligence that the emotional contagion that comes from a team leader has great impact. And by emotional contagion, I mean when they experience a strong emotion, the ripple effect to that team is significant. But what we also have to recognize is that how the team operates has a tremendous impact, meaning the climate that's created on that team is going to dictate in large part the level of employee engagement. Now, a key component on an engaged team brings us to our second point, which is appreciation, not just feedback. And it always amazes me that in learning and development, we see a lot of courses on how to give direct feedback. We see far fewer courses on how to receive feedback. But we see even fewer courses on how to effectively show appreciation. So it's something for us to think about. How are we showing appreciation? Because that's a building block. But in addition to being appreciated, employees have to connect their work to something that they care about. So we need to consider how the company work is aligning with individual goals and missions as well as the team goals and missions. Now, I think that what might be most surprising to people is this fourth point, that we are not seeing a definite link between engagement and the way people work. Now, certainly the way people work has changed and it does impact engagement, but what impacts employee engagement more is the consistent behavior that we need to see to create employee engagement. So these are behaviors like clearly communicating the vision of the team, eliciting employee opinions and acting on them. And just to be clear here, asking for employee opinions is only half of it. If you don't act on what you're hearing, you might as well not ask at all. So I've seen a lot of organizations I've worked with where they say, yeah, well, we did an employee engagement survey. And then I say, what did you do with it? And when the answer is nothing, they actually worked against employee engagement by having a survey and not doing anything with it at all. Another behavior would be communicating and demonstrating that employee well-being is important. And finally, I'd say effectively expressing detailed appreciation. So in short, these behaviors are as or more important than the way people are working. So now that we know what the experts are saying, let's look at the role that emotional intelligence plays in employee engagement. So for any of you in our audience who are not familiar with emotional intelligence, let's just take a quick look at the definition, which is your ability to recognize and understand emotions and your skill at using this awareness to manage yourself and your relationships with others. Now, this definition leads us to the 4 core skills that make up emotional intelligence. The first part of the definition, your ability to recognize and understand emotions, is what we refer to as awareness in emotional intelligence. And awareness is what you see, it's what you observe, it's what you notice. Self-awareness is what you recognize and understand in yourself based on your own emotions and tendencies. Social awareness is what you recognize and understand in others. That second part of the definition, your skill at using this awareness to manage yourself and your relationships with others, is what we refer to as management in emotional intelligence, very naturally. And management is what you do. It's your behaviors, it's your choices. So self-management is what you do based on your own emotions and tendencies. Relationship management is what you do when you take into account yours and others. So now that we're all on the same page with the definition of emotional intelligence, let's look at specific EQ strategies that, when practiced, will help increase employee engagement. So because the answer to employee engagement lies largely in teams and not the company culture, we can increase engagement by practicing the self-management strategy. Set aside some time in your day for problem solving. So during problem solving time together, teams can work to agree on the guidelines of behavior that will help all team members feel heard, feel respected, and feel valued collectively as you work towards that common goal. You know, people often oversimplify self-management. They think it's only about what do you do in the moment that you are emotionally triggered. But remember that self-management is a skill that is valuable in the moment and when practiced over time. So it also is a skill that serves you well in planning for future stresses or challenges. Now, in addition to recognizing the role team plays, let's also heed the advice of experts and focus not only on feedback, but also on appreciation. So practicing the relationship management strategy, when you care, show it, is going to take you far in making strides in appreciation. Now, sometimes I want to stop for a moment here, because when you care, show it. Sounds really simple. And sometimes people say that about emotional intelligence strategies. They're like, well, that's simple. Simple, yes. Easy, no. And more important than whether it's simple or easy is, do you do it? Do you do it on a regular basis? Because in order to be effective, appreciation needs to be timely. It needs to be specific, and it needs to be delivered to the correct person in a way that they will respond well to it. You know, some people don't like public displays, but they would be thrilled with a handwritten thank you note acknowledging their contribution. You know, a great example is in January at our company-wide meeting, we had an overwhelmingly positive response when our executive team publicly recognized people who were nominated by their peers for excelling in exhibiting our actual values, our company values. And there was a lot of applause, and there was lots of shouting and standing up in the room, but that's not for everybody. So we have to start looking at, how do we show appreciation in an effective way? Now, this next strategy applies to both teams and individuals, but it falls under self-awareness. In order to stay connected at work to something that we care about, all of us need to stop and ask ourselves why we do the things we do. You know, and I think of this on a team level in terms of vision, clarity of vision, and people understanding how their role contributes to the greater value in the company mission and the company goal. But I also remember very vividly a participant that I had in a course many years ago, and she was feeling particularly disengaged in her work. And as she worked through the program and the discussions and the activities with people in the room, what she realized was the work she was doing was not in alignment at all with her personal values. And so she came up and shared that with me at the end of the session, and realized she had to do some very deep reflection on what were her choices going to make, and in addition to choices she made, what changes might she need to make. People don't just need a how in the work environment. They need a why to feel engaged. So that's why we need to stop and ask. And because engagement is not specifically linked to one type of work environment, we all need to stop hiding behind that excuse that remote work or hybrid work is the root of the problem of low employee engagement. You know, we just get everybody back in the same room and it'll be perfect again. That's not the truth. We have to start using our relationship management strategy, build trust, because that's what leads to employee engagement, no matter where people are located. And trust builds when there's open communication, when we start to clearly know what the vision is. You know, I have been running programs for years, but also working with coaching leaders on 360 evaluation or 360 surveys. And one of the things I see show up a lot is a lack of open communication. What's the vision? What are we doing? Where are we going tomorrow? How does this play out? Trust also builds when there's a willingness to share and be vulnerable. Now, I think we have leaders of all types. We have leaders entitled, but we also have leaders just by their influence. And one of the things I learned early on in my career is the best thing for any type of leader to say is, I'll go first. So when we are willing individually to share and be vulnerable, we start setting the stage and opening it up to make it a safe space, a psychologically safe space for other people to share and be vulnerable as well. Building trust also comes when people are consistent in their words, their actions, and behaviors. If people start to see incongruencies, people are paying lip service and something is said, but it's not necessarily followed up on, then it's going to erode the trust and lead to lower employee engagement. Kind of akin to that, building trust comes when we are reliable and show follow through. That's what people are looking for. Otherwise, it's, well, you're not following through. Why do I have to care? And building trust comes when we make sure that we are operating with equity and inclusion in the treatment of all individuals in an organization. All of these things are going to lead to the deepening of connections. And so that's why it's important to know using that relationship management strategy to build trust is much more important than where people are located. So thank you, Maddie, for bringing up all these strategies now in the same place. We've talked about them one by one, but I want to make sure that those of you who have the Emotional Intelligence 2.0 book also know that you can read more about these strategies that I've recommended in the book as well. So we wanted to pull them together in one place and also give those of you who are interested a place to learn more than we have time for today. So before we go to some questions, which I definitely want to open up time for that, we do have a handout that Maddie will be sharing with you after the webinar. And this tool is going to help you really focus your use of these strategies and start improving your engagement in the organization before we come back together and evaluate where we are. So let's look at the handout. I want to give you an overview as to what we're asking you to consider. So the first thing that you can reflect on is, if you are a team leader, when you're going to carve out some one-on-one time to have those check-in conversations with your team members, that's the way that you're going to gauge what they need to feel more engaged in their work and their work environment. Now, if you're not a team leader, you are an individual contributor, ask yourself, how am I going to request this one-on-one time? Or how am I going to be the catalyst that gets my team talking about this in a way that we can start setting some behavioral norms and strategies so that we can move forward more effectively. The second thing I'd like you to consider is, how can you show more appreciation in a way that it reaches people? You know, it's a great thing to say these strategies, but it means more when we start looking at, what does that look like? How is it going to happen? When are you going to do it? How often are you going to do it? Who are you going to do it with? And what are you going to do with different people based on their preferences? So that's something to reflect on as well. The third item that I will ask you to consider is to think about how your work connects to your individual mission or values in life. And if you do work on a team, you can open this up to a team conversation as well. How does what we do align with not only the team, but the company's mission and values? How does our day-to-day work align with that? That can help people feel the value of what they do and not just what they do. And finally, whether people are working in hybrid, remote, in person, open up some dialogue for agreement on how you behave with each other. And not just how you behave, but how can you kind of gently nudge each other or gently remind each other when you're out of line in a way that might decrease engagement. So these are some things to consider around employee engagement. But Maddie, let's also see what questions that we've had come in that we can address right now.
Yeah, absolutely, Sherry. We've had a number of great questions come in, so I'll go ahead and start with this first one.
Okay.
If employee engagement lies more at the team level than the company culture, can you share a little bit more about how teams can lead engagement initiatives?
Oh, yeah, I love that. And the reason I love that question is that everyone is familiar with that classic team building idea of team building activities, you know, fun, high energy activities, games, group problem solving, whatever form they take. And while these are fun and enjoyable and they bring people together, what we know is that long-lasting engagement comes more from the day-to-day operations. So think of it this way. If you bring in lunch or you have a party, but day-to-day interaction runs counter to team engagement, then that party or that effort comes across as a little shallow or even hypocritical. So, it's interesting because what this also makes me think of is, after years of witnessing the phenomenon where individual emotional intelligence didn't necessarily create teams that were operating with high emotional intelligence, Dr. Jean Greaves and Evan Watkins took on the project of writing Team Emotional Intelligence 2.0. I was thrilled to be along with some of my other directors of trainings and other Talent Smart members to be contributors to this, but the two of them really took the lead on it. And what this helps people do is really establish strategies and norms of behavior that lead to more engagement in teams working more effectively together towards that common goal, understanding that consistency and agreed upon behaviors are really the key to engagement in a long-term and an ongoing basis.
Thank you, Sherry. Another audience member asked if there is any evidence that the pandemic has greatly affected employee engagement.
Oh, yeah. And I'll tell you, this is a question that we have received a lot, and we hear it a lot around social awareness and relationship management when we're looking at our 4 core skills. So what I'd like to share is that while the Gallup research that I brought up earlier does show some change between 2020 and 2022. So just to recall for everybody, March of 2020 was really when the pandemic hit the US in full force. But what was interesting in the data that was revealed was, yes, indeed, people felt actively disengaged in 2022, but the percentage of people who felt actively disengaged only went from 14 to 17% after the pandemic. And similarly, those who said they were engaged only dropped from 36 to 32% in this Gallup poll. So just to give you some frame of reference in a larger picture across time, in the year 2000, the percentage of people reported being disengaged was 18%, and the engaged response was only 26%. The reason that I'm sharing all these numbers is that certainly certain industries like healthcare were hit really hard. There were high levels of burnout in 2021 around healthcare simply because they were in the heart of it. So certain industries were hit really hard when it came to burnout and levels of feeling engaged and making a difference and valued. But overall, we need to remember that yes, world events and changes in work environments can impact engagement, but those variables alone do not account for how engaged employees are. Stronger contributing factors are clear and frequent communication, their quality interactions, focusing on employee well-being. So yes, we've seen a difference, but it's probably not as dramatic as some people have thought.
Thank you for that insightful response, Sherry. We do have another question. I'm going to try and summarize it for you. It's a bit long, but basically we have an audience member who is part of a new team that they've tried, to get them to open up by asking questions and asking for their opinion on things, but they're very quiet and they still don't get a lot of response. They think that because of company culture, this team's just very quiet and it's leading this person to feel like they should also disengage. So they just, want some advice or your opinion on that matter.
Yeah, that's that's a scenario definitely about that contagion issue. And sometimes if we feel like we're making an effort and it's not being met, we can be tempted to want to give up or quit or disengage ourselves. So the first thing that I would recommend is exploring how you're asking people to open up. Just for example, does anyone have any questions? Is one way of trying to get people to open up. But another way is, what, if I were in your position, I would have some real concerns. So what are your concerns? And just the way we phrase a question sometimes can make it safer for people to open up. Now, you could have a scenario where you simply have a lot of introverts who don't like to speak up publicly. So then you have to explore, are there other methods and ways for people to contribute? For example, here, putting something in a chat versus on a Zoom meeting, having to actually raise your hand and say something publicly. So do you have different ways for people to contribute? Also, are you just simply asking for people to open up, or are you taking the lead first? Are you sharing, showing some vulnerability, showing where maybe you made a mistake? When I work with new facilitators and I'm trying to get them to open up and feel safe, you know, it might be really easy for them to look at all the years I have in facilitation and leadership and not want to share how they've messed up. So the first thing I do is I kick off with the story of how I fell off a stage in the middle of a keynote address. So sometimes just that opening up with the vulnerability and the sharing yourself can lead people to feel safe. So those are some things to consider and think about. Obviously, it's going to vary from situation to situation, but one thing that I can tell you that we have to talk about in EQ all the time is we're never going to change somebody else. I always say that if I had the antidote for figuring out how to change people, I'd be a wealthy woman today. But we are always going to have the best results possible if we continue to operate with high EQ. So I encourage you not to quit, not to shut down, not to disengage, because sometimes it just takes people longer to operate that way.
Awesome advice. Thanks, Sherry. We have another question in here about really measuring that true definition of engagement that we discussed earlier, and really how to connect the dots between an experience that promotes engagement and the resulting, productivity or outcome. So how can we really see that connection and maybe measure that connection?
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because there are different ways of measuring outcomes, and all organizations are going to have their own metrics. And certainly you can do these activities, and then you can reevaluate something that you've done in the past, and see if you're seeing any movement, any change in the data. For example, if you are evaluating engagement around willingness to speak up and those types of things, and then you have some of these activities and you reevaluate, are you seeing that data shift and change? I still will go back to knowing that it's the day-to-day behaviors and the day-to-day you operate with each other that in the long term is going to show those biggest increases in engagement.
Thank you, Sherry.
Sure.
Another question we have here about establishing trust. Someone said at their company or within their department specifically, there's, a big revolving door. So they're wondering how to establish trust and build a team when they have that issue of people coming in and out and leaving and starting.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I would say the first step in doing that is, even though you're going to have people coming and going, if you can get on the ball right away and establish those team norms and behaviors, and if you need any, again, support doing that, you can look at Team Emotional Intelligence 2.0. But getting those in place, first of all, in some instances, may not be the case for this person asking the question, but in some instances, the revolving door slows down a little. When you actually get those norms of behaviors and things in place, people don't leave as readily. The attrition rate goes down. And so making sure that people feel valued, are heard, have some input into how you're going to operate with each other can lay a foundation that slows down the revolving door. But then the other thing is, if you have them in place, if you do have new people come in, immediately bringing them into that discussion, letting them know what has been discussed, but also giving them an opportunity to contribute. Don't just say, here's the way we operate and your opinion no longer matters because we got that figured out. Open it up to asking if there's anything that they have in mind that they would like to share for the group to consider.
Thank you, Sherry. And I'm going to circle back to a question we discussed earlier about engaging quiet teams, quiet employees, because
Sure.
we've had, at least 3 or 4 questions here. People asking how they can engage individuals that are on kind of the resistive or negative side, or people who want to really blow off those engagement efforts.
Yeah, and I'll tell you that resistance and that negativity can weigh on us. I learned years ago that the resistance and negativity is actually a very small percentage. I think I read years ago, I can't cite the specific study, but that the resistance and the negativity comes in at around 10% usually. And then those really gung-ho passionate people come in, the same around 10%. So the big key is, what about that 80% in the middle? And so they are going to sway one direction or the other, depending on what they have in the climate. So one, I will tell you, passion is contagious. If you are genuinely passionate about an initiative or something that is going to happen to further the business, that's going to be contagious, and that's going to pull in those people from the middle. Now, in addition to that, having those one-on-one voices be heard. Remember, I have on our worksheet for the follow-up. Think about how you can have those one-on-one discussions. Sometimes you can learn more about why people are negative and why people are resistant if you have one-on-one discussions, not where they're going to derail a whole meeting and undermine what you're trying to achieve, but where you can say honestly and openly, what is it, in a way that they're not going to be judged or penalized for it. Kind of a crazy analogy that I'm thinking of right now is when I kick off with emotional intelligence programs. The first thing I ask people to do is share what they're feeling in that moment right now. But I always lead off and say, make sure you know I'm not looking for something specific here. So don't tell me you're excited to be here if you're not. If you're overwhelmed, if you're stressed, if you're preoccupied, if you're resistant, if you're skeptical, anything is fair game. Because if we're going to open up dialogue, whether it's around emotions and emotional intelligence or anything else, we have to give people space to be honest without judgment, and then look at, okay, how do we move beyond it? So that's why I say doing it one-on-one can offer a lot more insight into what's really going on. And it can also ward off people who are just trying to showboat in front of a group. So those are some things to consider and think about.
Thank you, Sherry. And I know we've answered a lot of questions. We have a lot more, but I'm just going to finish us up with this last question. I think it'd be really great for you because I know we're always talking about how to be a good leader, leadership skills. So someone wants to know, is there a common mistake, or maybe there's several common mistakes that leaders make that can result in lower employee engagement?
Oh, yeah, great question. And I will tell you that, a common mistake is kind of hard to answer. And in doing 360 review consultation, as well as just listening to people over the years when I'm running programs, people are very open and honest in front of me because I'm an outside consultant. So I can share with you a few common mistakes that I hear that have reduced employee engagement. The first one that stands out to me is micromanaging. Micromanagement erodes trust, and it also limits employees' development. People want to feel valued. They want to feel like they can learn and grow and contribute. And when they are micromanaged, they start to disengage. Another one that I hear a lot, and I've mentioned it, but I'll recall it, is not fully sharing the vision. People just getting, teaching people the how to get things done, but not really sharing the why behind it. So that's another one I would consider. Oh, I hear a lot of disengagement when people perceive that resources are not fairly distributed, meaning they're distributed unequally, whether those are products or time or budget. When people feel that you're playing favorites, they will start to disengage. We've talked about recognizing achievements, appreciation, that one comes up. And then I would say the final one that I've heard a lot of is when people feel like they're in a position where they're being told that the whole story comes from numbers and metrics, and that both internal and external relationships are being dismissed as valuable contributors to the bottom line. So those are some that jump out that I've just heard regularly and repeatedly over the years that I would share right now.
Thank you, Sherry. So that's going to wrap up our questions. And thank you, everyone, for all the awesome questions I see coming in. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but That does bring me to our next point here. For any of you that don't know, Talent Smart EQ has started a LinkedIn Live series, and we do hold these monthly. We have different topics each month, but for this coming LinkedIn Live event on March 23rd at 10 a.m., we're going to be discussing engagement again with 3 different generations of women who will just really be talking about their experience as women in the workforce and with engagement. You can find this LinkedIn Live event pinned to the top of our Talent Smart EQ LinkedIn page. And also for everyone in attendance today and everyone who signed up, you will be getting the link to register for that in the follow-up email. So don't worry if you can't find it. And as Sherry mentioned earlier, we're going to have a follow-up to this Zoom discussion today with Sherry again. It's going to be on April 13th at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, and it's going to be really a discussion-based workshop where you can go ahead and use that PDF that we're going to send out to all of you with discussion questions, and you'll have a chance to talk about those with Sherry and with the other people who are on that follow-up workshop. So we really look forward to seeing you there. Go ahead and put it on your calendar if you'd like to attend. And thank you again for joining us on today's webinar. We hope to see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.